Why should I live in history, huh? I don't want to know anything anymore. This is a world where nothing is solved. When someone once told me time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again. And that little boy and that little girl, they're gonna be in that room again. And again. And again. Forever.
A giant of limitless power at man's command. And where was it science found that giant? In the atom, a particle so infinitely small that it takes over 100 billion atoms to make up the head of a pin.
This is Out of the Basement, a podcast dedicated to radiation medicine.
This is Dr. Jason Beckta broadcasting from a Vermont mountain basement where time loops like a flat circle, and I'm cursed to talk about the Radiation Oncology case rate, or ROCR legislation, yet again and again. Let's start with a bit of positivity because, believe it or not, I believe in credit where credit is due, but also I'm not inherently pessimistic, though it may sound that way. I would prefer the term realistic, but maybe these episodes confuse people. But the Astro Town Hall, which was held Thursday, March 13th, 2025 at 6:30 p.m. was actually a town hall. And that is very different than the summertime 2023 Friday at 4 p.m. short notice, no interaction, quote unquote, town hall. And to me, the fact that this one let us unmute, ask questions, put questions in the chat, which were read, that makes me think that maybe the powers that be might actually hear feedback. It might take screaming and hollering at an army of people in a couple of years, but hey, change is change. And so much so that the final question of the evening was my question that I put in the chat to Dave Adler, and he read it and it was answered. And so I think that's great. That was absolutely not what I thought was going to happen. And I sort of lost a bet on that. So props. But in classic Astro fashion, the kicker really came immediately. ROCR wasn't just planned for reintroduction. It was already back in Congress, dropped that very day. Surprise to us, I guess. So it kicks off with Dr. Howard Sandler beginning the multi-person presentations with a claim so surreal that it could have been performance art. And that claim was that ROCR's process has been collaborative, consensus-driven, and true to Astro's core values.
Building consensus. Consensus is important, and as a core value, Astro seeks to be collaborative and inclusive. Collaborative with stakeholders within the radiation oncology community, within the broader healthcare community, and with policymakers in Washington. The ROCR Act process has been faithful to those core values. From the beginning, Astro provided numerous written, virtual, and in-person opportunities to learn about ROCR with the goal of building consensus around the policy. Since the legislation was introduced last year, those efforts have only increased as we have engaged in extensive discussions with members, stakeholders, and policymakers, discussions that have enhanced the ROCR Act prior to today's reintroduction. We've made great progress and remain committed to further discussions like this town hall to improve upon the legislation going forward. Continually improving the legislation is important to us and also important to our legislative champions. We believe the bill and any necessary modifications will help achieve the critical goal, building consensus while preserving the core value of the legislation. The ROCR Act remains the clear-cut, consensus-backed solution for stabilizing radiation oncology payments in the short and long term in the face of potentially significant coding and reimbursement changes.
Collaborative for who exactly? The inner circle, maybe? The academic echo chamber that if I think really, really hard back to my residency days, where Astro was the glue in the chamber, the annual conference was the universe's center, and the weird thing is, and this is a data-driven statement, as far as I can tell, analyzing available information, about 20% of active practicing attendings and residents, I guess, are in those scare-up residency teaching institutions. And it feels like 100%. But for the 80% of us outside that bubble, which is practicing, I don't want to use the word or the term real world, but even though I'm technically academic, I'm faculty with the University of Vermont, and technically my boss is in Scarab. Technically, we're not a residency institution, and that seems to make all the difference. And there's only, between 90 and 100, maybe, I haven't looked in a while, maybe less than 90, but there's not a lot of those institutions. And so perhaps the 20% either knew or had heard whispers, but for the rest of us, that was quite surprising and not the definition of collaborative. And I follow this stuff pretty closely, obviously. And even I thought we'd get some kind of heads up. I honestly thought that this town hall was just going to be presenting the new draft that they plan for reintroduction. And I thought that because obviously I'd heard gossip and friends of friends, and something was going to be brought up about ROCR, but we hadn't heard much. And this is part of why this collaborative spiel felt so surreal. We had a blog post from the new CEO a couple weeks after ROCR died with the 114th Congress. But other than maybe some rah-rah ROCR mentions in the astrogram, there's nothing about this to the 80% rest of us. So really, when Dr. Sandler touts these quote-unquote extensive discussions, I hear an echo chamber that's really snug, very snug. And that's, as always, where we seem to start. The policy, legislative plan hatched in secrecy and claimed essentially as salvation, but pretty clunky. So I'm going to label it as clunky. And we're going to try to do a quick hit, high point, in-depth amalgamation of this new version of ROCR, and also some other pieces I chose to not cover earlier, figuring this day would come anyway. So buckle up. The upfront bullet point areas of interest for the 2025 version includes funding for adaptive therapies, stricter accreditation standards, and a 12-year technology adoption timeline/runway, which is transplanted onto the bulk of the 2024 version. And it sounds great. You can really make this pitch sound wonderful. And just beneath the surface, there's a lot of troubling aspects to this. Specifically, that ROCR appears designed to favor accreditation organizations like ACR, ACRO, and ASTRO, large health systems and equipment manufacturers, while placing undue pressure on smaller community or rural providers, which jeopardizes patient access. And specifically, what I'm concerned about with this edition, and I was also concerned about it with the last edition, is the blatant regulatory capture of trying to make it federal law when an organization writes legislation, trying to make it federal law to force a group of people or organizations or entities to purchase a product like Apex accreditation or face penalties for not doing that. That is the literal definition of, it'd be like Abercrombie and Fitch. Do you guys remember that? Putting a law into place where you can build orphanages in Africa. You remember that? pre-med joke, but build orphanages in Africa. But you got to do it wearing Abercrombie & Fitch t-shirts. Otherwise, you can never get into medical school, and that becomes law. I'm just really having a nice 90s flashback, but without significant revision. Again, this legislation really risks expanding care disparities and diverting what sounds like a public health initiative into corporate and private organization advantages. And we'll get to all that. But let's start with the only paper published calculating and exploring ROCR's impact, which is weird because I seem to remember a lot more of these for ROAPM. But in January 2024, so now a little over a year ago, there was a paper published from a group at Mayo in the Red Journal, which explored the ROCR model against real world data. They used the cute title, which I really enjoyed, and I mean that genuinely, of caught between ROCR and a hard place. But so it was a sort of independent, and I say that just because Mayo is interested in making this happen, but deep dive exploration of the bundled payment approach, which is the unique aspect of ROCR and taking us away from the fee-for-service current reimbursement system that is fraction agnostic. And the first author was the illustrious Aaron Bush. And again, this was great work. And they looked at 3,498 patient episodes from what I think was 3 Mayo centers, 3 Mayo clinics. A little unclear there, but 480,526 episodes from a National Medicare 5% sample spanning 2017 through 2020, and then compared their calculations from that sample to the ROCR proposed base rate. So in the end, with the ROCR rates, with the planned baked in 3% savings cut, trimmed reimbursements by an average of 2.4% at Mayo and 2.9% in the Medicare sample compared to historical. And that was a modest dip, and it was precisely sort of what ROCR was aimed at doing in the first place. But the devil's in the details, as the kids say. Kids love saying that. So bone mets, bone metastasis in particular, took a 7% hit in the Mayo data, which was the steepest drop. And most cancer types stayed within the 5% historical norms. And the obvious explanation is there's no complexity in a flat episodic reimbursement system. When you really dig into that, the curative intent treatments were reimbursed anywhere from $477 to $7,417 more under fee for service across 12 of the studied cancer types. So you had advanced stage cases, meaning stage 3 or 4 versus stage 1 or 2, added about 1,100 to 3,900 more in 8 of the 12 types. Even factoring in fractionation, which, as the old party line goes, paid per fraction, but even factoring that in, curative, intent, and stage held the most significant reimbursement drivers. And 25% of brain mets and 13% of bone mets episodes packed 2 or more treatment courses into the 90-day window, which was in the original ROCR, which also boosted the historical costs. And so shrinking that to 30 days, the multi-course episodes dropped 77%, which is better aligned with palliative care's turnaround, which, again, to Astro's credit, they actually did that. So the 2025 version does include shorter windows for palliative care patients. And it makes me wonder, because I always want to clarify this, I don't think anyone here is trying to do anything bad. I think the intent is pure. I think they are genuinely doing their best. And in short, I don't think the Illuminati is real. I don't think Dr. Evil is real, although the world would be a much easier place to explain if they were real. But I wonder if in Dr. Sandler's opening speech, talking about collaborative feedback and so on and so forth, if it's things like this, that's what he was referencing, because it's true. This was something that was identified in this work and was something that was fixed now. Caveat being, of course, this is coming from Mayo, and there are people at Mayo who are intimately involved in the ROCR process. So it's not exactly listening to really outside feedback, but hey, take what I can get. But while the abstract of the paper sort of whitewashes the 3% and cuts, and that's what ROCR was aiming for, the granularity of the actual data was very different. And you run into issues with curative and advanced stage specifically. And now the counter argument to this that I've heard before is it averages out. So the hard places or the hard patients will be balanced out by the easy patients that you might have gotten reimbursed less for. It's a little bit tough for someone like me to swallow because you would not imagine what walks through the door of my single Linac, single Radonc me clinic. The things I do on a daily basis are a lot more complex than your single disease site main campus academic attending. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I just, as a statement of fact, knowing what I saw during residency at a very large urban center with attendings who more or less get to focus on disease sites versus what I see every day. It's very different. Now, the paper does go on to acknowledge the limitations of the data, like if we're using the 2017 to 2020 Medicare claims information that might predate even more hypofrac and SBRT rise, that Mayo is a very specific, somewhat unique system, and their internal data might not mirror other data for the average American, however you want to say that. But the Medicare sample data also back these trends. And really, the question is ROCR as written going to underpay the tough cases and leave some of us, many of us, caught between a rock and a hard place? Again, great title, great paper. So let's move on to ROCR 2025 edition itself, and specifically 5 what I consider critical flaws from this iteration that more or less blatantly spell out regulatory capture and or pandering to industry in addition to regulatory capture. Number 1, as I did an entire episode on last year, we have the Health Equity Achievement in Radiation Therapy or HEART add-on, which provides $500 per patient identified with transportation insecurity if they are coded with ICD-10 code Z59.82. And this is unchanged as far as I can tell from last year. There are estimates that thousands or tens of thousands of patients are eligible, but the biggest flaw with this is the funds are directed directly to hospital accounts without any requirements to provide transportation. And that is just my number one sin of this thing, is it's a smokescreen where they make it sound great of, oh, we're going to identify patients with transportation difficulties and we're going to give them a $500 subsidy or payment or whatever. And then if you read the text of the bill, it is actually sent to the facility or entity providing or receiving the technical reimbursement. So normally, almost everywhere in America now, that will be the hospital or one of the rare private practices with technical ownership, or they own the machines, which is very uncommon now. But so there's a whole episode on this. But if people are W-2 employees in a hospital as physicians, they don't really think about this, or if you're a resident and you haven't looked at this before, this is the black box of hospital payments. It's just, it sounds great, but it's just going to go into the black box of hospital payments. This is meaningless. Beyond that, another significant concern persists, which is that we cannot claim this payment if these patients are receiving access to other federal or state assistance, such as the Medicare buses or Medicaid taxis. So we are, as always, as physicians, holding the liability bag to navigate the legal risks, because this would be a False Claim Act violation if we code the patient, or even worse, here's my scenario that concerns me. What if this is just part of an intake form? So what if some admin person adds to the standardized intake form, the checklist, the questions that would make them eligible for the HEART payment? And then on the back end, somebody codes your patient with Z59.82. This happens all the time. And you don't even know. What if you're not even involved in this? And then, unfortunately, this gung-ho admin, while they added the questions that would make the patient eligible or determine if the patient was eligible, that admin did not add questions asking about other transportation assistance. And so then you just accidentally committed fraud without knowing. But as always, the buck stops with the physician. And there's no easy way to verify this. So patients may complete treatment unaware of the heart benefit entirely, which renders the equity goal ineffective, to put it mildly, and puts us at legal risk. But a whole episode on this earlier. So number 2, we have adaptive radiation therapy, or ART, as I think they use in the legislation, receives new support in 2025, which this wasn't included at all in the previous version. So it introduces CPT codes and transitional funds, which would be great for precision treatments of shifting tumors. But, and this was my question in the town hall that was indeed answered, so this is indeed the case, it permits billing episodic rates alongside the additional adaptive fractions. The old double dipping, as I like to call it. Now, I would argue, and I haven't gone through the trouble of trying to publish this because I don't feel like it really, because what's the point? But if you go into the CMS claims data, you can see what I would consider certain large health systems leveraging codes like 77334 and 77338 already for such purposes. And surprise, surprise, these are 2 of the codes that are suggested in the ROCR legislation for could be used as adaptive. If you think I'm crazy, you can look at the 2024 EviCore guideline update. EviCore is the evil empire. Obviously, I'm not promoting them, but they specifically and explicitly within 2024 guidelines prohibit the use of 77338 for adaptive therapy. So the only way that EviCore would do that would be if they had already witnessed this happening. And the fact that this is already happening enough for me to notice it in the claims data, and for EviCore to notice it enough to ban it, you could see a quick path here for a huge financial advantage for well-resourced systems and providers. And I would argue probably the majority of radiation oncology clinics are not doing adaptive treatments yet. And the rich get richer, as they say. Point number 3, and perhaps the most concerningly hilarious, is the accreditation requirements escalate, mandate certification specifically through ACR, ACRO, or ASTRO. Only those 3, with now a 2.5% penalty after 2 years if you're not accredited through one of those 3, which is up from 1% and a 3-year grace period in the prior version of ROCR. And now this is the part, I don't know if this is pandering to industry or industry helped write this part. We have quality standards for accelerators, which will be influenced by manufacturers, could necessitate, LINAC upgrades. And as someone who is literally doing this right now, I will not give exact numbers because I don't feel like getting sued, but a new LINAC is a few $1 million per LINAC. And for smaller rural clinics, which from the rural standpoint is 10 or 15% of us are rural in America, this would not be sustainable for a clinic like mine. And if my clinic shuts down, we're looking at doubling patient travel distances. There's a health affairs article on this, and it would be increasing at least another 30 or 60 miles. And I'm the only LINAC for an hour in any direction, my neck of the woods. So I have patients that do drive 45 minutes to an hour to get to me one way, and I'm the closest. So we'll just say that that would be suboptimal. Now, what I suspect is going on here is membership in ASTRO has declined, and we'll get to that in a second. And they need to make up for that lost revenue with this. And if you can look on, so ASTRO as a nonprofit entity has to file IRS 990 forms. IRS 990 forms are publicly available, and you can go back in. The line item for Apex is either Apex or quality improvement. It only shows up in recent years. It's also in their financial annual reports, I believe. And it was $1.4 million when I wrote that PRO letter to the editor last year. And it's increased in this 2023 one. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I think it was 1.6 million. But double check me on that, because you can, because it's all out there. And where I get my membership decline is also through that. So you can look at all the 990 forms and you can see the revenue from membership dues. And then you can use the Internet Archive / Wayback Machine to find all the old annual membership due fees. And so looking at the active member category, which is the attending physician category, which is arguably the largest subsection, because obviously I recognize that there are multiple subtypes for physics and residents and so on. But in terms of the lion's share of the membership revenue, I would argue it's from the active member. And so if you look at the revenue generated from the membership dues based on the 990 form, it went from $2,875,000-ish in 2011 to $4.2 million in 2024. So that's a 46% increase. However, the annual due fee for the active member category went from $475 in 2011 to $775 a year, which is the current one. That is a 63% increase. So they increased their active membership dues 63% from 2011 to 2024, but their revenue for membership dues only went up 46%. So there's a 23% gap there. And the only way that gap exists with membership dues going up is fewer people having memberships. And one of the bonuses, if ROCR were to pass as written, there would be capturing Apex dues or Apex fees. Now, every time I bring this up, somebody will say, well, there's a choice. Okay, so there's ACRO and ACR. That's sort of a choice, I guess. But 2 out of the 3 of those, ASTRO and ACRO, are the ones who are interested in this legislation. We'll put it like that. ACR, if they know about it. I mean, I know there's that thing that said they know about it and support it, I think. But we all have to acknowledge that it's a choice, quote unquote, but it's a wink choice. It's not a real choice. Fourth point of concern here is the technology adoption runway extends to 12 years, which is up from 10. And that is linked to the ART incentives and equipment standards. And this structure favors urban or large systems with the capital to invest in advanced technologies like surface-guided radiation therapy, which leaves people without the capital or willpower to invest in new technology to this degree a leg to stand on. But with the acknowledged double dipping of the adaptive CPT codes with the M code episodic payment, that makes me question, makes me wonder, is everything on the table like that then? Are there going to be multiple loopholes of receiving reimbursement for the episode? But also, if you're lucky enough to have one of these fancy new pieces of equipment, do you get to bill for that too? It's a clear enticement to industry. To quote The Godfather, everybody gets their beak wet, and it's concerning. And then finally, with the fifth point here, the exemptions shift from the 2024 small provider designation to now a limited resource category, which actually I liked somewhat more, in part because there was a little bit more definition behind what that was. The problem was that there is a now 10% cap on who can get relief, meaning I don't know how this would get resolved in practice here, but if you qualify otherwise, but you're a new kid on the block, or you were slow in getting your paperwork in, and the 10% is already full, are you not going to get the exemption? Given that you can run the data on the Medicare claims, the estimates are we have about 10% of practices are rural, which is, it doesn't have to be rural to be a limited resource practice, as it were. But 10% means that some people are going to not be given grace, even if they otherwise meet the requirements. And in a general, bigger picture, I've talked about this in real life with friends and colleagues, and I don't remember how much I've said on this podcast or on X or on other forums, but I have some fairly large concerns about oversight weaknesses, and specifically beyond just the body of the text, the points, those 5 points, those 5 highlights, as it were, that I just listed. there are concerning features of the legislative and oversight structure of this. So by taking radiation oncology out of the traditional Medicare umbrella and putting it under a congressional authority, it really brings unique and significant risks and might, if you think about it, be the reason that no other medical specialty has ever conceived, let alone attempted this. Maybe. So the savings adjustments in the structure of the text lack an upper limit. And that means it could potentially exceed the 8% projected cuts if fiscal priorities shift. Funding depends on annual appropriations, which is different than the current regulatory consistency of the fee-for-service. Consistency, I put that in big air quotes. I'm not necessarily defending fee-for-service, but you are rendering us vulnerable, rendering the rates vulnerable to political fluctuations, which maybe we have seen that recently with shutdowns or near shutdowns of the government, or maybe significant cuts to longstanding programs or bodies like, I don't know, USAID, something like that. Maybe just spitballing here. The 5-year rebasing cycle caps reductions at 1%, but this safeguard can be altered by future legislation, which would expose us to unpredictable financial strain. And I realize I need to clarify this because if you read through the bill or listen to them talk, this is not very obvious at first glance. So specifically what I am talking. So this is a lot in subsection D2, I believe 1899C, I think. But so in the annual updates in the payment floor, subsection D2A ties annual adjustments to the MEI and hospital inpatient market basket with a floor barring reductions below prior year rates. That's explicitly written in there, and it seems to shield rates from the whims of politics and delegates that responsibility specifically to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. But the fact that ROCR is a broader legislative framework keeps Congress in charge. So while the Secretary can't cut rates yearly below the prior year rates, Congress could, number one, amend the law, which would revise or scrap the floor via new legislation, or squeeze funding, such as tweak appropriation, nudging CMS to stall increases of budget shrink. But a deficit-strapped Congress could, cap rates below inflation, which would erode rates over time. I just really want to drive that home. This would make radiation oncology reimbursement a separate piece of legislation that has to be approved annually, at least the budget. Let's say if it passes, the budget would have to be approved annually. But because it is a standalone piece of legislation, Congress could modify this at any time. And so, yes, it is written in these safeguards about cuts by the Secretary, but nothing about if Congress wants to amend the law. Point number 2, we have periodic rebasing in the 1% cap. So the 5-year rebasing cycle limits cuts to 1%, which if you assume a 2026 rollout, that starts around 2031. And it's a buffer, but not bulletproof. So Congress could, number one, rewrite the cap, lift it to like 5%, or just ditch it as the winds shift. Again, like 2024 is near government shutdowns or near shutdowns in the past. Number 2, exploit savings. These uncapped savings adjustments could outstrip the 1% limit, especially if Congress legislatively expands its reach. Number 3, and always my favorite, because how we're here is backdoor deals anyway, but number 3 would be just applying pressure. They could lean on the Secretary via appropriations to reinterpret what rebase really means and skirt around it that way. And again, while it's being presented as, 1% safeguard is rock solid, it's a shield, it's just statutory ink, and that can be altered. Point number 3 is congressional overhang. So subsection D2 stability, the annual bumps, cap rebasing, it doesn't erase my favorite talking point here, core vulnerability that is a congressional construct. It's not a regulatory fixture like fee for service. And again, not defending fee for service, but they're apples and oranges here. And it's sort of a funding roulette with annual appropriations choking budgets. It could stall rates despite these supposed floors. fee-for-service is under CMS's autonomy. And not saying that, again, fee-for-service is good, and not saying that CMS can be altered, but because we are in the giant pool of everyone, so right now, if they wanted to start messing with Medicare, which despite some talking points from pundits, that hasn't happened. And there's a reason for that. And maybe it will when I'm recording this year in March of 2025. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's a lot harder for trickery to be played with all of Medicare versus if there's this weird, unique standalone piece of legislation where some grandstanding congressman or grandstanding Senate candidate who gets in, this would be an easy thing to say, look, I'm saving money with these wasteful radiation oncologists, and what are we going to do about it? 5,000 of us, what are we going to do about it? So beyond the weakness of the congressional construct, we also have an oversight delay. And so we're not getting a comprehensive evaluation of ROCR for 7 years. So if we were to enact this year, there would not be a look back saying, how did this go until 2032? Now, recognizing that that is way too long, if this is going poorly, there's a rural access report mandated in 3 years, but no interim assessments are mandated. So maybe there's some additional unforeseen disaster or something, I don't know. And something hits the wall really at year one. All right, well, good luck. Nice knowing you. So even though the congressional construct weakness, vulnerability is unavoidable should we go down this path, there could still be changes that I would like to see that would improve this new version of ROCR and potentially actually help people, providers and patients alike, instead of just profiteers of all shapes and sizes. So off the top of my head, what I would propose are 6 reforms. First, overhaul heart, if I were to have crisp diction. So replace these $500 payments with, I don't know, a CMS radiation access network, which would offer ride shares and vouchers, fund it with a $10 million pilot, trial it in 20 rural counties starting at 2026, and eliminate restrictions on this dual aid eligibility with automated verification tools. So if it's approved on the CMS side, just you're good to go, because on the CMS side, that's where the verification is going to take place. Second, reform accreditation. I would make this first, but heart fake equity really bothers me. So with reform accreditations, limit the fees, the annual fees to have a program for accreditation to $4,000. So Astro, Acro, ACR, if you offer radiation oncology accreditation, the max annual fee is $4,000, and open it up to other ways to meet this quote unquote quality standard. So you could pilot a peer quality alliance, put $15 million into it, and have independent audits for over 3 years. So if you have a loose collection of clinics not part of larger health systems, they could band together and provide their own sort of peer review and have it standardized and you can't have just 3 agencies able to provide accreditation and the organization who wrote the bill and is pushing it is one of those 3. And there's a lot of overlap with 2 of the 3. It's just insane. Also, you got to remove the manufacturer influence on standards. Are you crazy? No, you cannot allow industry to provide input on the legally required and captured accreditation quality standards. That's just crazy. Why would you write this? You got to take it out. And if you really want to include or influence or improve quality, I think that investing in more machines and doohickeys are necessary. Give $10,000 stipends for rural clinics, a 1% innovation incentive or something. But whatever it is, manufacturers cannot have influence on quality standards, and you can't just have 3 organizations providing accreditation that you have to pay for. And they wrote the bill. It's crazy. So a third, for this technology access runway thing, let's kick it back down to even below the 10-year thing. Let's say 7-year exemption. And why don't we endow a $40 million Rad-On Tech Hub? And for the entities that qualify for the exemption of the limited resource provider, they can have access to this grant system, whatever you want to call it, and share, acquire, whatnot, adaptive therapy resources, for example. And then why don't you incentivize these clinics and give like a 2% bonus for the first 50 or 100 clinics who are not currently doing adaptive, who choose to get the technology to do adaptive. And alongside that, for number 4, you got to do better for the small and rural communities. Come on. You can't have a 10% cap on this. You go to 20. And again, finding some sort of cute alliteration like Rural Radiation Resilience Fund or something. Just get grant programs to and give clinics money to modernize, or whatever reasons they were meeting the criteria for limited resource provider and exemption. Try to bump them up. Because, all right, just to zoom out here, like what are we doing? The theoretical purpose of things like accreditation and these quality standards is to improve patient care. Therefore, if you truly believe accreditation, let's say, does improve quality, you should have 0 exemptions. You should be finding each and every way to bring every single clinic in America into these accreditation programs. And so instead of just flat out giving an exemption forever, if you get the exemption, there needs to be a strategy to bring you into the fold. Otherwise, this is all fake. Okay. So if you're going to write in these exemptions, which you should have, but you also really believe in accreditation and new technology stuff, you've got to have a pathway to make those clinics eligible or able to afford it or something. Because otherwise, this is pretty naked of what's going on here. If you don't really think that accreditation improves quality, you just want the revenue or the smoke screen. Number 5, you got to regulate these double dipping things, the adaptive therapy billing. If you're going to allow billing adaptive on top of episodic payments, one code per episode, unless clinically justified, you got to, come on, can't do that. And 6, per the wonderful January 2024 Bush et al. Article on ROCR and a hard place, there actually does need to be an adjustment for treatment complexity. So while maybe it gives some people ROAPM PTSD, payment modifiers, which was also in the wonderful ROCR and a hard place paper. And so you take their data, you can verify it if you want, it's very well done, but put a modifier on for 5% more reimbursement for curative cases, 7% for stage 3 and 4. And you could also add a reduction of 3% for palliative. You could pilot this in a small group if this gets enacted, but you can't just, whenever I bring up ROCR, so it's a true story. I was trying to explain ROCR to one of the nurses at my clinic last week. And the very first thing after I was done with my rambling, she asked me is, but why is there a flat payment? What if you have really tough patients? Literally, the first thing after my rambling was she recognized the issue with flat payments and complexity. And 7th, and I would argue most important because it's kind of core to this whole endeavor here, and probably why no one else has tried this before, you got to try to shield payments from congressional risks. So right into the bill, cap savings at 5% yearly and 10% total, requiring a 2/3 vote for more in Congress. You need to lock in 5-year funding and you build in a reserve, like $50 million reserve, and then cap rebasing at 5% over 10 years with MedPAC review and mandate any approval for cuts over 3%. There are ways to safeguard. Now, nothing is sacred. Obviously, laws and governments are all man-made and can be manipulated, but the naked risk of this, I have a hard time believing that this was not identified. I don't know what is going on here because the congressional staffer for Senator Tillis's office was on the call, was on the town hall call. You're telling me that kid didn't identify this, didn't bring it up? Do you guys think that this isn't really a risk, or what is going on here? This is so obvious. It needs to be addressed because everything else falls apart. You could craft perfect legislation, but if you get a Congress in session that is looking for things to cut, it's an easy victory to score political points or whatever is going on, this is a sitting duck. Come on. In conclusion, ROCR has evolved from 2024's adventure to this 2025 corporate capture-driven framework. The great paper published a year ago confirms the financial risks. The legislative details reveal the bias interests in capture, and oversight shortcomings really guarantee prolonged uncertainty. The HART program lacks substance. Adaptive therapy favors the affluent. Accreditation burdens the vulnerable. Technology access widens disparities. And rural or limited resource provider exemptions run short. Without significant revision, there are many practices that are at risk from ROCR. And ROCR itself is at risk from Congress because, again, there's probably a reason no one else has ever tried this before or even floated the idea. And despite all this, there is an opportunity, should actual collaboration take place, to redirect ROCR towards its allegedly stated mission of equitable, high quality, and stable care. And we all need to press for these revisions immediately because, surprise, ROCR was already reintroduced. Christmas came early. I don't know how well the sarcasm is traveling, but I hope it's dripping. Each moment of apathy or inaction is causing harm on many fronts. And if nothing else, the blatant pandering to industry and accreditation capture needs to be addressed to actually prioritize patients and not the top 20 healthcare systems and certain titans of industry, or it will really be the crowning sad achievement of a specialty that's been shooting itself in the foot for 20-something years.